Hi everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to work waste yarn into your knitting. This is a really interesting technique that has a range of applications, such as for knitting afterthought heels in socks and afterthought thumbs in mittens. Although there are many other applications and the only limit is your imagination. You will be literally knitting your live stitches for your project with a waste yarn rather than your working yarn. And then you can later come back to the waste yarn once your project is finished and undo it, which will reveal live stitches. You can then pick up those stitches and work them in a completely different direction to the direction your original knitting was worked in. So let's get into it and see how this great technique is worked and just how easy it is to work as well. So I'm just going to knit to the point where my pattern says to knit in waste yarn. So let's just pretend that my pattern says it's right here. So all we're going to do then is drop our current working yarn, the yarn that we're using for our project, and we're going to grab some waste yarn. Now it's really important that you use a contrasting waste yarn because you want to see where you've put it in so that it's easy to come back and undo it later. So I've got this yellow yarn here and I'm using the same weight of yarn as the weight of yarn that's being used in my project. So let's say that the pattern now says to knit in waste yarn over my next 4 stitches. So it'll be these 4 stitches here. And it's super easy. All we're going to do is pretend like this waste yarn is our working yarn and use it to knit across those stitches. So I'm just holding it as if it's my working yarn and I've just got a tail that I'm holding with my left hand fingers at the back of my work. And if you're a continental style knitter, you can hold that tail with your right hand instead. And then we just knit those stitches as normal. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm just going to drop that waste yarn from my right hand. Once again, if you're a continental knitter, you'll be holding it in your left hand. And I'm going to slide those 4 stitches back to my left hand needle, or the number that was worked in the waste yarn. So we do this purlwise, making sure that we're not twisting any of the stitches as we go. So just one at a time. Slide them back to the left hand needle. And if you've used contrasting yarn, it's really easy to see which stitches need to be slipped back to the left hand needle because they're in a totally different color to your normal stitches. So now we're going to pick up our working yarn again, it's where we left it, and we're going to knit across those 4 stitches once more. So they've already been worked once in the waste yarn and now they're going to be worked again in our working yarn. Just as normal. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we can just knit the rest of our stitches to the end. So whether you're working in the round or flat, this is exactly the same because it's all done in the same row or round. Now this can look a little bit messy, so to neaten it up all you need to do is tug on the ends of your waste yarn and they're just hanging at the back here. So when we neaten it up we can see that those stitches look like all our other normal stitches, it's just that they're in another color. Now that's all you have to do for now. The rest of your pattern will just be following the instructions you've been given as normal, and those stitches the next time round will be worked just as normal stitches and they've returned to our original working yarn color as well. So let's just say my next row of the pattern says to purl to end, just purl those stitches absolutely normal. So I'm going to continue with my pattern and it won't be until the very end of the pattern usually that you will then come back and undo those the waste yarn and return the stitches to the needle. So I'm going to finish off and get to that point and then we'll come back and see just how we do undo that waste yarn. Okay, so I've now finished knitting my project and my pattern is telling me to return to my waste yarn. So I'm now ready to undo it and return these stitches to the needle. Now, The easiest way to do this is to have your project facing you in the direction it was knit. So the direction that it was knit is pointing away from your body. So this little swatch that I made was knit from bottom to top. So it was knit this way. And so that's the way I have it facing me. If it was actually knit this way, then I would swing it around and instead have the project like this, so that the direction it was knit is facing me and going away from my body. I just find that that is the easiest way to pick up the stitches. Now you're going to need a needle to work with to pick up your stitches, and generally, but not always, when you return these stitches to the needle, you're going to be working them in the round. So it's a good idea to use a needle that's designed for working in the round. I've got a circular needle here, but you can also definitely use double pointed needles. It will be doing the same thing either way. So what I'm going to do is find the right leg of my stitches. What do I mean by the right leg? Well, let's take a look at the stitches in our waste yarn. They look a lot like a V. So if we counted this half of the V as the left leg, the right half would be the right leg. So we've got 1, 2 halves, and I'm going to call this the left leg and this the right leg. We're actually not going to be touching these stitches in the yellow yarn. We're going to start with the row of stitches below it. So it's the same thing. We've got these little V's. This half of the V would be the left leg and this half would be the right leg. So we're going to start from the far right and then pick up each right leg, working from right to left. So the first stitch we need to pick up is here below this yellow V, or whatever colour your contrasting yarn was. And it's this stitch here, which has become a little bit twisted and misshapen. But that's fine, you can still find the right leg. So that's the left leg there. I just need to use my needle tip to coax the other half of the stitch out, and now you can see it looks like a V, like the other stitches. And I'm going to work from behind the right leg and then come through the middle of the stitch like that. So you sort of picked up going around behind and then in front of the left leg of the stitch. So that is one right leg that's been picked up. Now we're going to move to the stitch next to it. Going to come around behind the right leg and then we go up through the middle of the stitch. And that's 2 right legs. And then the third, like that. And then the fourth. Now you remember that I worked my waste yarn over 4 stitches, so I have 4 stitches to pick up. If you worked it over 5 stitches, you have 5 that you need to pick up, 6 stitches, etc, etc. You're picking up as many stitches as you applied waste yarn to earlier. But you now also need to come around and pick up along the top. So in actual fact, you're going to end up with double the number of live stitches now on the needle as to how many stitches you worked in waste yarn. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We applied and knitted in waste yarn over 4 stitches, so we're actually going to end up with 8 live stitches in total. So because I'm using a circular needle, I'm going to need to pull my needle tip out so that I can now come around this way. If you were using a double pointed needle, you could then just come around and use a second double pointed needle to pick up those stitches. But what I'm going to do is push this tip out so I can now use it across here. And once again, we're going to pick up the right legs of the stitches, but we're going to pick up the stitches above the contrasting waste yarn. So now we're going to come through the middle of the stitch and then pick up behind the right leg. Once again, middle of the stitch behind, middle of the stitch behind, middle of the stitch behind. Now if I pop those stitches on the bottom onto the needle, you can see that we've finished returning our stitches to the needle. That's them all picked up. And now the fun part, we're going to undo that waste yarn. So I'm going to grab another needle. If this was DPNs, you could just use a 3rd DPN. Otherwise, if you're using a circular needle, you will just need a spare needle, or you could use a tapestry needle or something for this as well. Just anything that will help you pull out that waste yarn. So I'm going to start from either side, doesn't have to be from the right side. And we're just going to pull out each leg of each of those stitches in the waste yarn. So we're going to pull, and it can be a bit hard to pull that yarn out. You could also cut it, but I like to just remove it so that I could then reuse this yarn at a later date if I wanted. Just one at a time, coax the waste yarn out from between the stitches, and you start to see, and just be careful that you don't lose them off the needle like I just did. If so, just really carefully slide them back on. You do need to be careful while you're doing this because you don't want to lose any of those stitches. As I was saying, you can see now how we are ending up with 2 sets of live stitches. So I've just got a few more to undo. A few more stitches in the waste yarn, and then you can just pull it out of that last one. And now we're done with the waste yarn, and there are our stitches. So these are now ready to work however your pattern asks you to. Generally the first round in which you're working them, you'll also be picking up some stitches in the gaps between them, because if I pull those stitches apart, you can see that if I start knitting them, there's going to be a little gap on either side. So you might need to pick up some stitches here and here. Or these could be worked flat, so you could just be working these stitches and then you come back and work these ones separately. But that is just up to your pattern. It'll tell you exactly what to do. Otherwise, that is how you work waste yarn into your knitting. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or comments, do leave them below.